So if you find yourself saying something you might regret later, let me know and I'll edit it out. Right, well, welcome one and all. It's my intention in some way, shape or form to transport you to Austen land today. Just close your eyes and try to imagine being in a sort of idyllic rural scene. There's a vicar who lives in a sprawling vicarage. There's a local village community. There's a member of the aristocracy, the landed gentry that lives just up the road in a large house who oversees the sort of the tenants and the people who live on their estate. Now open your eyes and you're there. You're here in Edinburgh. In some sense, this is a kind of a snapshot and a window into a world that's kind of gone by now, but in some sense remains certainly here in this part of the world in Lincolnshire, because this vicarage, this Georgian and earlier vicarage, is still owned by the Grimsthorpe estate. We've got Lady Willoughby, our ecclesiastical patron just up the road as well. So, as I say, as I've spoken to people from the North American Jane Austen Society from here before, it kind of fits that image. And it would be tremendous fun this morning, at least for me, if we were to spend sort of the bulk of our time immersed in the wonderful world of Georgian Anglicanism, and say where the clergy are either pompous or pious, destitute or debauched, learned or lecherous, sincere or, in the case of Mr. Collins, slimy, at least according to my daughter, and she's watched the 2005 film of Pride and Prejudice more times than any of us care to remember. However, that's not really our remit here today. What we're here to do is to look at the common Christian inheritance that we share with Jane Austen in the form of the Book of Common Prayer, to consider how it shaped her life and her novels, possibly to learn from her example, such that it might have a more lasting influence upon us here today. So here we are. Now, the reality for us that we need to consider first off is that the Book of Common Prayer represented something very different to Jane Austen than it does to us today, try as we might. In her day, it simply was the liturgy of the Church of England, and de facto the liturgy for the colonies, later the Empire, and of course a good portion of the English-speaking world. Nowadays, we exist on a somewhat varied liturgical diet. Then, it simply was what was. And moreover, Jane Austen's experience and use of the prayer book was whole and rounded and complete in a way that ours simply cannot be. She would have been familiar with every word said at every baptism, wedding and funeral before they happened. Not the case today. When you book a wedding, you have to sit down with the couple nowadays, show them various options and allow them to become familiar with the words they will then use on the day. When people book baptisms, they've no idea what the actual content of the baptism service is, nor of the promises that they'll be making on the child's behalf. And funerals take an awful lot of work in order to bring about, to curate, if you like, the content and find out what it is that people would like to be said about the individual, music, hymns, etc., on the day. All that was very different for Jane Austen. Funerals were, as every funeral was. It was the case that you assembled, possibly in the church, more likely in the churchyard, and the service was read. And that was what people expected to happen, and that's what they wanted to happen. That was what they were there for. And more than that, Jane Austen would also have known some of the prayers that perhaps we overlook in the prayer book. The forms of prayer to be used at sea, she'd have been very familiar with them, with reference to her brothers Francis and Charles, who both served in the Navy. That was a way in which she could have a spiritual link to them, even though they were far from home, overseas, and she wasn't in communication with them. But not only that, as a parson's daughter, Austen would also have had an awareness of what was required practically, in delivering the various prayer book services, she'd have been aware of the role of the clerk to answer the services, to lead the people in their responses, and also the responsibilities of the sexton to dig graves, to maintain the water in the font. And of course there was the records, the registers that needed to be maintained, and that those of us now feel the benefit of if you've been tracing your family history. In short, Austen's idea of what constituted a lovely service vicar would have been quite different from our own, and we need to acknowledge that before we delve deeper. So let us then delve a little into the life, the letters and the novels of Jane Austen to better understand her use and understanding of the Book of Common Prayer. So we're going to begin with repetition. Now, I mentioned this before at our previous prayer book retreat day, but repetition deserves, well, repeating. Liturgical repetition is on the decline today, and it's almost sort of a bit of a dirty word, really, with variety being valued above all. But not so for Austen. Attending church most Sundays, and then also with morning and evening family prayers in the home, based on the forms for matins and evensong, and then private prayers upon waking and before going to bed, grace before meals. When you add all of that together, even by conservative estimates, most think that Jane Austen would have said the Lord's Prayer more than 30,000 times in her life. Now, that does something to a person. It really does. It embeds words, ideas, pictures, and cadences in the consciousness of a person like little else would, and certainly not on that scale. And when you think of it in those terms, you see what an extraordinary influence the Book of Common Prayer was upon Jane Austen because of her use and because of that culture of repetition that existed within the kind of the liturgy of the church and the observance of people who attended. Now, speaking of attendance, we must ask the question that concerns every Church of England cleric, regardless of their outlook and their churchmanship. Namely, did Jane Austen go to church? If she were a member of one of our congregations, would she have been of the more reliable sort? Well, I'm pleased to say that the answer is yes. Yes, Jane Austen went to church. Alleluia. How do we know? Because she tells us, and in some respects, she doesn't tell us. She doesn't often mention going to church because it was just a natural part of her life and her week and her expression of faith. She doesn't mention it an awful lot in her novels, and that's led some people to question her Christianity, her faith and her allegiance. But most scholars would agree that she was very regular in her church going. And her letters and her novels paint that picture of regular church attendance, both on Sundays, and also an awareness and response to the liturgical calendar. She knew what time of year it was as far as the church was concerned, and that was also reflected in her attendance. Now, in Steventon Church, one of the parishes that was served by her father from 1764 to 1801, we understand that services took place once in either of the churches that her father served. It was a morning service in one church, an afternoon service in the other, and the family were expected to be present at one or other of those services. So single service attendance on a Sunday was the norm, and when writing to her sister from Bath in 1801, Jane Austen thought it newsworthy to tell her sister Cassandra, "On Sunday we went to church twice," as if going twice was just a little out of the ordinary. Now, that stands slightly in contrast to perhaps Victorian patterns of church going, and indeed sort of later, and perhaps of your own memory as well, where you would be expected to go to church twice on a Sunday, morning and evening. That might have been to the morning service, then to Sunday school, or morning service and then to evensong. But for Jane Austen, once was the kind of regular pattern, such that when she did go twice, it was newsworthy and she'd write and tell someone about it. Now, that's sort of Sundays taken care of. But what about holy days and feasts? Well, later in 1805, Jane wrote on Thursday, note Thursday the 11th of April, how Mrs. Buller was to attend church with them on the following day, a Friday. Any guesses which day that was?
Good Friday.
It was Good Friday. Okay. So again, within the letters, you start to detect a kind of a normality of Good Friday church attendance. And it's also referenced, but very subtly so, in Pride and Prejudice, where we hear that Mr. Darcy had been seen in church in the days leading up, either week before, Easter Day, Easter Sunday. And from that we can detect that it was either Maundy Thursday or Good Friday that he, as the landowner, was expected to be seen in church. What, I hear you say, Anglicans going to church during Holy Week? God forbid. Yes, my friends, that was the reality, and you've sort of seen it and heard it here first. Now, having said that, what, if anything, would keep or prevent Jane Austen from going to church? Well, the answer lies not with noisy children, or indeed the need to entertain visiting relatives over Sunday lunch, two of the key excuses that we're all familiar with. No, what occasionally kept Jane Austen from going to church on Sunday was far more shocking. Any guesses what it was? Rain. Rain. Indeed. On one such occasion, with ill weather expected, Jane wrote to Cassandra to tell her, "I do not venture to church," because of the rain. Now, ill weather and the chance of resulting illness is something that weighed heavily in the minds of Georgian folk. And of course, you can see that it was the chief cause of Marianne Dashwood's illness in Sense and Sensibility. She went out walking in the rain. In fact, I attended a wonderful sort of comedic version of Sense and Sensibility at, Woollerton Park in Nottingham. And the theme that they kept coming back to all through this kind of sort of comedic sort of presentation of it was the fact that the worst thing in the world that you could do was go out walking in the rain, because it was almost you were bound, at least in a Jane Austen novel, something bad would have come from it. Okay, and you had the spectre of consumption hovering over the people of Georgian Britain, and anyone unlucky enough to catch a chill, well, even the most rigid of parsons would have overlooked absence on that basis. But just don't go getting any ideas. Okay, don't sort of send me an email saying, "I venture not to church, I fear I have a chill." It won't stick. There we are. So she definitely went to church. But what was the church, or the service, if you like, that she attended? Well, more often than not, it would of course have been matins and evensong. Now, even though the prayer book provides, as we know, the collect, epistle and gospel for every Sunday in the year, plus sort of high days and holy days, communion was celebrated infrequently, possibly monthly or quarterly. At All Saints in Southampton, where Jane attended between 1806 and 1809, communion was made available more regularly, but it was only for those who remained after attending the morning service. And the would-be communicants had to make their way past the pulpit, which was located centrally in the building, because the chancel and the altar were behind it. So you sort of physically had to you had to make that decision to go to communion, and then you had to be prepared to be seen to be one of those people who was then venturing forward round the back of the pulpit in order to do so. So it was a very kind of public thing. There's at least a suggestion that that very public display and intention might have put people off, but there you go. Now, what this tells us, of course, is that Jane Austen's staple diet was that of the Psalms and the lessons for the day, together with a sermon. And even when not attending church, she's recorded in one of her letters as saying that she had the Psalms and the lessons and a sermon at home. So even when she wasn't attending church, she still, in a sense, had to, or chose to, maintain that pattern of reading and engaging with the Psalms and the Bible lessons for the day. That was her sort of bread and butter. And followed each day the prayer book table of psalms and readings would have ensured that the Bible was read through each year, the New Testament twice, the Old Testament once, together with parts of the Apocrypha, and of course the Psalter each month. And again, that has a deep and profound effect upon someone. And it also shaped their expectation of church and worship in a way that's perhaps quite different from our own. And we might contrast that with our own situation today, when so many people often speak of needing to go to church solely to get or to make their communion. And indeed, where one or two people might even complain that the readings, meagre by comparison, are a bit long. You know, sometimes you look, I mean, if you're attending one of our churches, you might look at the pew sheet and go, ooh, the type's a bit small this week and the readings are a bit kind of long. But of course, that's nothing compared with the original 1662 prayer book lectionary. You know, the readings were really quite sort of long, but you knew and felt that progression as you made your way through the Bible. And because of that repetition, you were immersed in it. You were pickled in it, to use one of the phrases we used to have at Murfield. So Jane Austen knew her Bible. And it was the prayer book used in public and at home that gave that Bible reading shape and purpose, and that shaped her own expectation of what church going was. And you see this sort of later when she starts talking about her brother Henry, who's sort of ordained later, and she speaks of him sort of getting his first time reading the service over. And again, that you've got to think about the expectation. The expectation is that the words you knew and the words you had in front of you would be read, and will be read clearly and accessibly. And the Bible readings with which you were already familiar would also be read and presented, and the Psalms which you knew off by heart would come round again. And it's that again, it's the immersion in the familiar. Quite different from sort of people coming to church to something perhaps that they've not seen before, or they're not sure about, they don't know what's going to happen, and they may then make a private or personal judgment as to whether that worked for them, or whether they got something from it, if you like. Totally different from Austen's experience and expectation of church going. So moving on then from Matins and Evensong, we come to the visitation of the sick. Now, as just mentioned, Jane Austen's brother Henry was ordained priest on the 2nd of March in 1817, towards the end of Jane Austen's life, at what's now the Church of the Annunciation Marble Arch in London. And full of admiration for the way that Henry conducted his first communion service, Jane wrote to her niece Fanny Knight on the 23rd of March to say this. She said, "I hope that he, Henry, will be in time for your sick. I am sure that he must do that part of his duty just as excellently as the rest." So she's hoping that Henry will be present in order to make the rounds, if you like, to cover the expected visitation or visiting of those who are sick or ill and so unable to get to church. And that would, of course, involved reading the office for the visitation of the sick, and perhaps also providing communion for them. And communion, of course, wasn't the sort of the pre-already consecrated elements taken round. It was a shortened form of the service that was sort of said, if you like, there with the individual person. So it wouldn't be a kind of quick, nice to see you, here's your communion, cheerio. It would have taken time and consideration in order to be able to minister fully and fulfill that expectation. And we also hear of her other clergyman brother, that was James, travelling with the son of two of his parishioners to a hospital in Gosport in order that they might know the condition of their other son, a Marine, who lay wounded there. So again, you see this practical outworking of the priestly ministry towards a sick man and his distressed parents. They didn't know how their son was, what his condition was or situation. So it was the role of the parson to go on their behalf, accompanied by a member of the family, in order to minister to him and to bring news of his condition and situation back to the parents. It's sort of a pastoral engagement, again, on a level that's perhaps sort of been lost somewhere, certainly in our own kind of modern parochial ministry. Very much sort of at the heart of what was happening to the people. Now, moving on then from the visitation of the sick, we come inevitably, I'm afraid, to the burial of the dead. Now, as the daughter of the rector of Steventon and Dean, and if you want a little insight into what the interior of Dean Parsonage might have looked like, as you come in, or as you go out to the entrance hall, you'll see there's a pencil and watercolour painting just above the settle. And that was painted by Julia Lefroy, who was a niece of Jane Austen, and it's supposed to be the interior of Dean Parsonage. It's one of my dodgy items of Austen memorabilia, but that one's pretty kosher. But if you want to know, have a look outside. Julia was one of, as I say, Jane's nieces. She was in her infancy when Jane died, so they did meet. I looked it up in her letters. It's sort of, they did meet, but Julia was just a babe in arms when she met her aunt, and I say that was shortly before she died, but that's out there. So, where am I? Yes. So, her father being rector of Steventon and Dean, Jane would have been aware that her father would, from time to time, have had to walk up the lane from the vicarage to church, or that he would have rode over to Dean to conduct a funeral. That would have been a kind of natural part of his ministry and also their domestic life. And we need to remember that in those days people died on the whole much younger, that infant mortality rates were high, and that pregnancy itself came with great risks also. So again, it's sort of a sad reality for us, certainly, that sort of permeated the lives of people back then. And of course, this impacted on Jane's life. Biographers often mention the death of the Reverend Tom Fowle, who was the fiancé of Jane's sister Cassandra, that he died of yellow fever whilst working as a missionary in the West Indies in 1797. And we know that Cassandra mourned the loss of her fiancé for the rest of her life before she died as a spinster in 1845. But what of Jane's own attitudes towards death? How did she see death, and how is this expressed in her writings? Well, again, we see something of the influence of the prayer book, perhaps in two ways. Firstly, if we look at Jane's letter to the daughter of her father's half-brother, following the death of that half-brother, you see a kind formality as she writes to console her relative. She wrote, "The loss of so kind and affectional parent must be a very severe affliction to you and to all his children, but the very circumstance at which present enhances your loss must gradually reconcile you to the better. That being the goodness which made him valuable on earth will now make him blessed in heaven, and this consideration must bring comfort." So just having a look at that for a moment, just unpacking it a bit. As I say, the language is rather formal, just need to delve into to find what she's getting at. But first, notice that there's no suggestion that prayer might be offered for the soul of her dead relative. That's not a part of the landscape, the language, or the culture of Christianity in Georgian England. But there is, we might note, thanksgiving for the goodness of the individual who's died, linking the virtue that was cultivated in him with the virtue by which he will then be welcomed into heaven, that virtue being Christ. She was saying, look, there was much that was good in him, and the good that was in him was realized by the one through whose good we are saved, and so he will be, and so heaven will be open to him. And in a sense, that for Jane Austen is where comfort and consolation are to be found in the face of death. It's echoing the sure and certain hope of the committal prayer for the burial office in the Book of Common Prayer. That's the kind of the language and tone and angle that consolation in the face of death took. Again, quite different from our own. And secondly, the expectation of death brings with it a responsibility. And it's a responsibility that we're all aware of, but that you might not be aware also finds its expression in the Book of Common Prayer. Because if you read the rubrics for the order for the visitation of the sick in the Book of Common Prayer, you'll find the following. It says, and if he, that being the sick person, have not before disposed of his goods, let him then be admonished to make his will, and to declare his debts, what he oweth, and what is owing unto him, for the better discharge of his conscience, and for the quietness of his executors. So actually that encouragement to make sure your affairs are in order, and to write your will, to make sure sort of everything's sort of as it should be, that's actually found and expressed in the Book of Common Prayer. It's not the law of the land. It's a very good suggestion that people might make from time to time, but it's actually there in the service book of the Church of England. That's where sort of putting your affairs in order comes from. It's the instruction of the prayer book that reminded generations, many generations, of the expediency of making sure that their affairs were in order. And so it's perhaps no surprise that when Jane Austen knew that she was seriously ill and unlikely to recover, she first received Holy Communion while she was still able to give her full attention to the sacrament, and then secondly, in accordance with the Book of Common Prayer, she made her will and testament on Sunday the 27th of April 1817. And I think I can put it up there. There it is. And she died in Winchester on the evening of the 17th of July 1817. So very, very simple last will and testament, recognising her brother Henry, her sister, a friend, and also that her sister would be her executor, and that debts for her or expenses for her funeral were to be paid from what remained. Now, here we are. So as not to end this morning session on a sad note, and it's just greyed over outside and started raining as well, so I do apologise for that. I'm going to try and sort of concertina, if you like, 3 more services from the Book of Common Prayer with which we know that Jane Austen was familiar. Those being weddings, baptisms and ordinations. So the first, inevitably, is the solemnisation of matrimony. Now, most, if not all of Jane Austen's novels end with a sort of a happily ever after and a wedding. But Jane, as we know, never married herself. Now, that didn't prevent her from attending weddings, of course, both actual and also fictional. Because one of the greatest treasures that actually belongs to Steventon Church is the marriage register, which begins in the year 1754. And as with modern marriage, well, until things changed a year or so ago, all marriage registers had what we call specimen pages as part of the introduction, sort of, blank examples and also worked examples, so we knew what we were doing. And it seems that a young Jane Austen filled in the details in those specimen pages of the banns of marriage that were to be published between herself and the fictional Frederick Howard Fitzwilliam of London. But not just that, she then went in and filled in the marriage details between herself and Edmund Arthur William Morter of Liverpool. And then, not content with that, she also inscribed herself as being married to a slightly lowlier Jack Smith as well. Now, in addition to that, Jane and her sister Cassandra, together with their brother Henry, they were occasionally called upon and required by their father to act as witnesses at weddings in the 2 churches. And this was required by the Marriage Act of 1753. You had to have legal signed witnesses from then onwards. That was the same act that brought into being the register that her father used and which she sort of scribbled in the opening pages. And we know that they acted as witnesses at the marriage of their cousin Jane Cooper, their mother's sister's daughter, in 1792, who then tragically died just a few years later in a carriage accident in 1798. Okay. So that's weddings. Quick note on baptism. As I mentioned previously at our retreat day, looking at the public and also domestic use of the Book of Common Prayer, Jane Austen was actually baptised twice. Now, this is a little odd, and it kind of does go against the rules. After all, we believe in one baptism, but Jane Austen had two. It was actually the case then that following her birth in... Ooh. Hang on a minute. I got that for dramatic effect on the video. Hang on a minute. Let me just deal with the alarm. The last alarm.
Yes. Edmund Church does not have a minor.
Yes. Just while I'm waiting for that to warm up again. It doesn't like being deprived of electricity. But Jane Austen was baptised twice. First following her birth in 1755. She would have been immediately and informally baptised at home, because of the spectre of infant mortality. And then also on the 5th of April the following year, 1717, she was formally and publicly baptised in church once her health had been established. And that was sort of the pattern, if you like, for a lot of children, especially the kind of middle and upper classes, if you like. They were afforded that luxury. Others would just have been baptised at home as soon as possible. So, marriage, baptism, finally, ordination. Now, although the ordinal is not strictly part of the Book of Common Prayer, Jane was certainly familiar with it, having not only her father but also her two brothers in holy orders, together with numerous other relatives. Theirs was very much a clerical family. And we have recorded that on the 29th of January 1813, having finished preparing the manuscript of Pride and Prejudice for publication, Jane Austen wrote this. She wrote, "I will now try to write of something else, and it shall be a complete change of subject, ordination." Now, any guesses as to which novel she's speaking about? Sorry? Mansfield Park, absolutely. It's Mansfield Park. The question of ordination and its deeper meaning comes up for discussion as the story of Mansfield Park unfolds. I mean, really, you're looking at perhaps the first third of the novel. It seemed to kind of tail off a bit later, but certainly in the early portions, it's the ordination of Edmund Bertram, the second son of Sir Thomas Bertram, who we're told was destined to be a clergyman, which was, of course, the natural occupation for the second son. However, things don't go according to plan, excuse me, because the debts of Sir Thomas's eldest son, Tom, are such that his father was forced to sell the right of presentation excuse me a moment, to the clerical living of Mansfield in order to pay off Tom's debts. So Tom, being the eldest, of course, would inherit. Edmund would be a clergyman, and he would have the living of Mansfield. I say, because of the extent of Tom's lifestyle and debts, it had to be sold, and so Edmund is left at a disadvantage, deprived of the income and the status that would otherwise have been his when he took holy orders and then would have been appointed as the rector of Mansfield. So we're told that instead he was to have the living of the nearby village of Thornton Lacey instead. And so the new occupants of the parsonage, those who were appointed instead of Edmund, they of course bring with them the characters of Henry and Mary Crawford. And Mary, as you may recall or be aware, becomes something of a potential love interest for Edmund. And upon her discovery that he is not only destined but actually looking forward to taking holy orders, she expresses some astonishment. Okay, she says this: "So you are to be a clergyman, Mr. Bertram. This is rather a shock to me, for what is to be done in the church? Men love to distinguish themselves, but not in the church. The church is nothing." And later she adds, so she doesn't stop there, later she adds, "A clergyman has nothing to do but to be slovenly and selfish," just be aware, "read the newspaper, watch the weather, and quarrel with his wife. His assistant, the curate, does all of the work, and the business of his own life is to dine." So a very poor appreciation of the clergy and their status from Miss Crawford. Of course, she doesn't want Edmund to be ordained. For her, that would be sort of limiting, embarrassing, and below par. But undeterred, Edmund is ordained deacon, and that took place, although fictionally of course, not far from us here at Peterborough Cathedral. And that took place in the course of Christmas week. Now this might sound, again, a little odd to us nowadays. Ordinations more readily take place around this time of year, in Petertide. But then it wasn't unusual for ordinations to take place at or around or just before Christmas, following the Ember Days, the days set aside for prayer for those to be ordained, that were traditionally observed on the Wednesday, Friday and Saturday before the third Sunday of Advent. So when you have that kind of ember time, that opens up the way for the possibility of ordinations to follow. But curiously, as I mentioned, after his ordination, everything kind of goes quiet on the subject within the kind of dialogue of the novel. We only hear once of Edmund actually taking a service. We're told that he had gone through the service once on a Sunday, presumably that was Matins or Evensong. And even in the film adaptations of Mansfield Park, you don't really see much of a kind of a change in the kind of attire that the character of Edmund wears. He doesn't suddenly begin to look like Mr. Collins from Pride and Prejudice or such. That, you know, it's not really emphasised. It's just part of the conversation, the dialogue. It sort of establishes Mary Crawford's objections and her slight sort of snootiness with regard to the clerical state. But it also begins to establish sort of Edmund's moral outlook, although that sort of later wavers with the performance of Lover's Vows, if you recall that from the story, that the in-house play that's a little bit saucy. But then it's sort of firmed up again by sort of Fanny's example of steadfastness and sort of her sort of moral sort of anchoring, if you like, whilst everything is chaos all around. So as I say, after this point, there's little or no mention of his clerical activities. Rather, the focus is in the earlier part of the novel, and that's really the sort of the questioning and banter aimed at an individual who is hoping to be ordained. You know, questions about their motives and intentions for doing so. And that kind of questioning continues today. If you happen to sort of slip into conversation, or somebody discovers that you're intending to be ordained, or you're seeking ordination, you're an ordinand in the Church of England, people will start to ask you why, be a vicar, what's your view on this or on that, have you ever met the Archbishop of Canterbury, all that kind of thing. I've met the last three, just to let you know. So essentially what we see after Edmund's ordination is that the story then sort of splits off from this kind of theme and heads in various different directions. There's Maria's disastrous marriage to Mr. Rushworth. There's Henry Crawford's pursuit of Fanny Price's hand in marriage. There's Edmund's continuing attachment to Mary Crawford, all for it then to come sort of full circle in Fanny's rejection of Henry, his subsequent affair with the bored Maria, now Mrs. Rushworth, Mary Crawford's condemnation of Fanny's actions in rejecting her brother, and also her shocking belief that it would be better for Tom, the heir apparent who's sort of terribly ill through the latter part of the story, well, she thinks it'd be better if he died and Edmund inherited, thus creating a diversion from his clerical duties. If he inherited, all that clerical nonsense would be put to one side and she would have his time and attention all to herself, and of course his inheritance to boot. And it is, of course, the steadfast and virtuous Fanny Price who serves as this kind of moral example and rock around which all is later resolved, including her eventual marriage to Edmund, who at last has a rector's wife to argue and dine with. Now, not to be outdone, Mary Crawford does have the last word with Edmund, as he recalls, we don't actually hear her saying this, but he recalls her saying it to him, that now the story is concluded and he's now sort of to be married and is continuing to pursue his clerical career. She says, "At this rate, you will soon reform everyone at Mansfield and Thornton Lacey, and when I hear of you next, it may be as a celebrated preacher in some society of Methodists, or as a missionary to foreign parts." Clearly not cut out to be a parson's wife. So that's where I'm going to leave it here this morning, just as it started raining, for which I do apologise. Now, after communion and lunch, we'll be considering Jane Austen and the Eucharist, how she viewed the sacrament, how she prepared in order to receive this, and how this teaching and outlook manifests itself in her novels and writing. There we go. So Holy Communion will be in the church at 12 noon. Fingers crossed it may have stopped raining by then. And we do have candles in church, so even if... Yes. I venture not to church. There we go. Does anybody have any questions just at this juncture? We'll probably do a bit of a kind of a roundup after the second session. Yes, Rachel.
Parson, vicar,
Yeah.
priest, rector,
Yeah.
and living.
Yes.
I always remember my mother-in-law was quite sort of snobbish, saying, well, he's not a gentleman. So there's this kind of a thing that the second son was educated and becoming a priest. Can you explain something of that sort of culture?
Well, I mean, it was to find sort of useful and meaningful employment. The clerical status was, even for those who weren't born into it, it's sort of minor gentry status for those who attained it, even though their living, as I say, could be, they could be scratch poor, to be honest with you, because each church had an income which derived either from legacy or from lands, which is where you get the glebe lands. You get glebe close, glebe this, glebe that. That would have been the original kind of glebe land from which part of the income might have been derived. Or in the case here of Ednam, the income would have been in the gift of the Ancasters. And again, that could vary tremendously. And later, I think, I'm right in thinking, over into Norfolk, where, if I've got this right, the fens were drained. Land that was glebe land that was otherwise sort of you weren't able to cultivate it, suddenly, once it had been drained, became very rich, such that you had a couple of parsons in Norfolk whose income rivaled that of the Archbishop of Canterbury.
So she had Fleet and Gedney in Lincolnshire, which were the same.
Well, they were quite...
Fleet, Fen, all that, and the Fleet Marsh.
Yeah.
Wealthiest parish in Lincolnshire.
Yeah. So, yes, I mean, you have the kind of... you've got those who sort of pursue the clerical sort of state from very good and wholesome motives, if you like, and those who are kind of born into a certain degree of privilege who then sort of pursued it as a kind of wholesome activity. But then you also get, alongside that, you get the sort of the hunting parsons, those who are really just sort of interested in kind of rural sports and the social life and what have you, did their duty but weren't engaged pastorally in the way that we can see that Henry, Jane's brother, was. So there are some people say that the Georgian church was sleepy and that not a great deal happened. If you read, there's various books which are good to read on the subject. Let me just this is my own private bit over here. Amongst them, Irene Collins, Jane Austen, the Parson's Daughter, is a great one, and also Jane Austen and the Clergy, also by Irene Collins. These are the two you really want to kind of read on. It's just so much fun reading all about the stuff that people got up to. I mean, priests even put sort of ads in newspapers seeking after a parish where the hunting was good and the pastoral responsibilities were light. So it's a very different world. And in a sense, a lot of that's represented by Austen in her writing with her clerical characters who come in for a lot of stick and are exposed for their kind of frailty and also for their laziness and being sort of self-absorbed on the one hand, but then you get others who are sort of more highly regarded, if you like. And certainly in her own family, it's very much the case that her father and brothers were very sort of fully engaged in pastoral ministry and life. It was slightly different when it came to preaching, because sermons didn't necessarily follow the cycle of readings, and most sermons were written to be repeated. So I think there's one existing sermon that we know that her father preached at Steventon, and from the little annotations and things that are on it, we can see the various times at which it was preached 6 or 7 times. And the thing is that people actually had their favourite sermon, and they sort of longed to go, oh, it's that right? I like this one. Okay, this is good. Again, it's that sort of repetition is good and familiar. And what have you. So just as you might sort of get the DVD box set and relive your favourite episode of whatever it was, in the same way people kind of hoped that their favourite sermon was coming up in the cycle at church. And of course, sermons were published and available. So when Jane talks about having the Psalms and lessons at home and a sermon, that would have been one that would have been published and read. She had her favourite preachers. She was quite scathing about evangelical sermons. She kind of changed her mind a little bit towards the end of her life. First of all, she said, I don't think we should be evangelical. And then little sort of towards the end of her life, she was saying, well, I think there's something in it. But she wasn't fully subscribed. Does that answer your question much?
Three things, not really connected.
Sure.
First is, there, on that wall there, is that pen and ink drawing.
That's right, yep.
Which is that room bit. This was an extension in the early 20th century, but that drawing there was found in the attic here. It's on the back. It's dated 1830, and that obviously is this room with the vicar and his daughter and a cat.
And am I right in thinking you can also see through the window a summer house? Yes. Which was built to prevent people walking through the garden, because it's a public right of way.
It's a public right of way, so you had a summer house there. You can see there's a shape there where it was put. Yeah. The second thing is, I had one of my training vicars had his sermons, which the choir called the Yellow Pages, and he used to put the dates on them. And on Sunday morning, you turn up to church and say, I'm using spiritual capital this morning. The third thing is more serious, which is about the quest for holiness. So if you've got unholy clergy, does it prevent the quest for holiness in the laity?
I would say not, because in a sense the liturgy served the people regardless of the worthiness of the minister. Because in a sense the liturgy was what was, to quote myself, as long as the parson delivered it correctly, he wouldn't get in the way.
Yes. So that's what people mean when they say he takes a nice service.
Yes.
In other words, he doesn't get in the way.
Yes. Which is, again, I think that's it's sort of another topic in a sense. I think it's one of the dynamics within the Christian life and seeking to share our Christian faith is to not get in the way, actually, but to be able to present things and make it accessible so that people can readily access it and they don't have to go round, past or through us in order to do so. One other thing just to show you before we kind of break, and it has just stopped raining, thank goodness, is I mentioned that Jane Austen attended All Saints Church in Southampton, which was a Georgian-built church. When she lived in Southampton, I'll tell you later, I think it was between 1806 and 1809. Now that church was bombed and completely destroyed in the Second World War, and two things remain from it. One are the parish registers, which I think were recovered from a safe, and the second thing is this, which is the altar prayer book, which is from the time that Jane Austen attended. So we don't know, but I like to speculate that it might have been on the altar when she attended, and we'll hear about a particular occasion at which she attended and was scandalised later this afternoon. So that's all that remains. So I'm hoping to retire on this eventually. You never know. It did appear in an article in Jane Austen's Regency, whatchamacallit, and what have you, where it was incorrectly stated that Jane Austen might have used it. I don't think she would have done, but it could have been used in her presence. You never know. But there is a plaque on the wall of the Oxfam shop that's there now in Southampton. If you go into the city centre, it shows you where the church was, and there's a Jane Austen trail you can do around Southampton. But I was rather pleased with this. It was about £30 off eBay. I don't think anybody realised what it was. Okay. Anything else before we break? Oh, yes.
Little question. Parson and rector and vicar.
Yeah.
At the children's school, we play in this song called The Parson's Farewell, which is out of dancing last time. And all
Yeah.
children say, so what is a parson and why is, and is Father Ed a parson?
I am.
And we talk about parsonage, vicarage, rector.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of specific thing that makes somebody a parson? I know it's generally a rural country
Yeah.
kind of thing, but what are those? What's the nomenclature for all those?
Well, well, parson is very general.
Means person. It means the person.
Okay.
The person responsible. The pastoral person.
What's the pastoral?
And vicar or rector depends on how the living was funded. So, if I'm right in speaking, it's I think a general rule of thumb is that rectors tended to be income derived from glebe.
Yes, and therefore they had the legal responsibility for the chancel of the church.
Right. Okay, that was in as well.
Yeah.
Whereas vicar tended to be an endowed post.
For vicarious representative.
So Jane Austen's father, in order to supplement his income, farmed a portion of the glebe rather than then sort of rent it out. He also had a boarding school for boys in the attic.
Well, there was a school here
as well.
course.
Was a school here as well?
Yeah. Herbert Stainsby.
Yeah.
Brenda had a special. She was a special baby. She couldn't really go to school because there was something about her physical condition. So he taught her at home, and then some other children from the area came and made a class with her. So that's in the 1940s.
Right. There we are. But of course, I mean, the other way of supplementing income was to practice pluralism, which was to seek after an additional living from which you would derive the income, and then from that pay for a lowly curate, someone without a living, to do the duty for you. I was a pluralist in Grimsby, but I had to do all the duty. Certainly couldn't afford it to pay someone else to do it out of my stipend. But that was really kind of ended in the early 20th century, or the early 1900s. I think it was about that. So, and of course, people could say write and do schools and all that kind of stuff as well.
Going on in the 60s, weren't they? I think it was the early 70s, wasn't it?
1950s when the stipend was introduced.
What was it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Glebe endowment measure enforced in 1978.
All
So
right.
that's the date in which my predecessor put in the claim for expenses. Before that, it was a very good living, Cranford.
Yeah.
Right.
Enormous
I think
income. And then he lost it all.
I think the 70s there were bits around still in the 70s.
Yeah.
You'd
When I-
go through Crockford's up a certain stage, and if it was a vacant living, you specify the net and gross income from that living.
Yeah.
And mercenary minded people would go for a living and have a good income, you see.
And of course, if you were, I don't know if it was rector and or vicar, but you were entitled to tithes from the people. So you had to find a polite way of requesting a tenth of everything that everybody brought in, if you like. So that must have been an interesting way of introducing yourself to your to your neighbours. When I was rector of Scartho, there was still an existing piece of glebe land at the back of the churchyard, and there was no vehicular access to it. And I inquired with the diocese as to whether the local school could use it as a little sort of nature area, and they said no, nothing can happen on the glebe, because they wanted to keep it and it not to fall into any kind of other recognised or regular use, even though no one could do anything with it. So it just sits there to this day.
Because one day they might be able to do something with it.
Well, if the house adjoining it came on the market and they bought the house and demolished it and got vehicular access, they could build a bigger property and realise some. But they don't want anybody to have any sort of any kind of claim on it at all.
Am I right in saying that in the 50s and in the 60s even, that priest vicar still had the Easter collection?
Yeah.
He did, didn't he?
Yeah.
I don't know, but I once did the.
I'm sure they did.
I was asked to attend a birthday party of a lady in one of my congregations. It was her 100th birthday, and she talked of how she and her brother were required to curtsy when the rector's children passed by. Just think. I won't tell Jess. There we go. I think we should leave it there for now, so you've got a bit of wiggle room before Holy Communion at 12 in church. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry.